relatives to kind of knock me out. And I have heard that, you know, particularly as a black man, I'm probably likely to be given higher dosages of sedatives than somebody who would be white. And I think that can play into ideas of suppressing, controlling, fear. It's fear of this big black person rather than, you know, treating them and looking after them, and that's quite scary.
It's incredible that in the 21st century, my race could affect how I'm dealt with by the health system. I want to find out how deep this problem really runs.
Hello there.
Hi, David.
You must be Dr. Douglas.
Yes, I am.
I don't know whether we can actually do our elbows, but we'll just say hi.
Okay, hi, yes, yes.
Dr. Jenny Douglas is a public health expert and a senior lecturer at the Open University who has spent decades researching racial inequality in our health services.
Black people have experienced discrimination and racism, certainly for the last 40 years, you know, in terms of health services. And I think people have not wanted to recognise that this is happening.
In what ways would you say that they've experienced that racism? How has it kind of manifested itself?
My work has focused very much on black women.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are stereotypes about black women being more aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
They're not being listened to when they're in pain. The health professionals think that they're over-exaggerating their pain, and they're turned away, or they themselves fear seeking treatment because they're going to receive poor treatment. These are matters of life and death. A report that was published 2 years ago highlighted that black women were 5 times more likely to die in pregnancy and childbirth.
5 times more likely to die in childbirth.
It's horrifying.
That's extraordinary.
And we shouldn't have a situation like this.
That's really sad and disgraceful.
Time and time again, black women said to me they weren't listened to. You know, they had been in hospital, they'd had their babies, they didn't feel well, and they were sent home, and they had to be rushed back into hospital because, you know, there was something wrong. Now, they knew there was something wrong, and they tried to tell, you know, the kind of health professionals that there was something wrong. But often they don't hear us. They don't listen to us.
The idea that poor treatment or the fear of poor treatment contributes to black women being at 5 times the risk of dying in pregnancy and childbirth is a scandalous example of health inequality. Dr. Douglas wants me to meet Sylvia, whose daughter died giving birth 5 years ago.
Her name was Delissa. She was 26 years old. She was having her first child. She loved children. She found out very early that she was having a little girl, and that's what she really wanted. Delissa presented at the hospital the day before she died in a lot of pain. She was 1 centimetre dilated. They said that she's in early labour, and the doctor that examined her said that, you know, the reason why the baby's head hadn't engaged was because black women's pelvises are different than white women's. And so therefore the baby would not be engaged. Well, you know, as a mum, I found that really strange because I've had several children. I know the first child that you have, baby's head engages in early labour. They sent her home. Delissa went into full-blown labour in the early hours. We took her back to the hospital. She was 9 centimetres when she got there. Delissa was rushed for an emergency caesarean, and she did not recover from that caesarean. The cause of death was pregnancy, but there were errors in her care. If somebody had just listened to her, telling them that she wasn't feeling well, telling them that she was in pain, if they had just listened, I can't help thinking that it would have been different.
As you say, people don't listen to us. People deny our reality. It makes people feel uncomfortable to have this conversation. But these conversations need to be had.
Yeah, definitely. These conversations do need to be had.
You know, I'm 55 years old, and I'm quite ashamed that this is an issue that I've only just become aware of. It's shocking. Racism and discrimination plays a major role in the health outcomes of black people. Not only are we dealing with a biological pandemic, but the pandemic of racism is also affecting us. So we're sort of battling not just one virus, but two.
I understand the role that systemic racism can play in creating inequality, from jobs to living conditions to medical treatment. But there's a radical school of thought originating in the US suggesting that racism itself could be making us ill. Professor Arlene Geronimus believes the lived experience of racism can take a physical toll on our bodies.
There was a narrative that I think there's been some version of throughout American history, but certainly was true in the second half of the 20th century, that the reason people of color have worse health is somehow their own fault because they're deficient in some way. It might be culturally deficient, behaviorally deficient. It might just be educationally deficient.
Yeah.
Whereas I would say it's more likely to be because of what I called weathering. Weathering is what happens to your body down through your body systems down all the way to your cells when you live in a racist society and you are the target of that racism.
Yeah.
When you're chronically stressed, you have stress hormones going through your body over hours, years, decades. And that starts to erode your immune system.
It's almost like it's almost like the increasing level of stress that what they're having to deal with is having on their bodies.
Absolutely. Anyone who is put under sustained and cultural oppression would have this physiological reaction.
I can remember growing up as a child, whenever I'd be walking home from school and somebody would just shout, nigger out the car or make monkey noises or and I can remember that fear, that I'd be tense and I would sort of get all tight and I'd sort of there'd be that rush of adrenaline that would go through my body. And then when I was 23, just like 30 years ago, I had a psychotic breakdown. So I ended up in a mental institution. Do you think that this weathering played into something like that?
Absolutely. It affects everything in your body. It's not just one condition. Some people it might manifest in maternal mortality. Some people it might manifest in diabetes or obesity. So in the case of COVID-19, it's not just that Black people are more likely to get COVID, but it's that they're more likely to die from it at a younger age. And that's, I would say, very likely because of weathering. Because what weathering does is it, in effect, makes you biologically older than your chronological age.
An extraordinary bit of research. And I can completely see it. You think about it, over the years, the sorts of stuff I've had to deal with, the racism I have to deal with, the discrimination that we've had to deal with. You think about the cumulative effects of dealing with all that. It is exhausting and wearing. It is literally weathering, eroding, the erosion of my sanity, because it does just wear you out.
2020 was an extraordinary year. COVID took a brutal toll on Britain, claiming the lives of tens of thousands of people. Against the backdrop of the pandemic, the murder of George Floyd created a perfect storm, exposing more clearly than ever before the deep-seated social and economic injustices faced by Black communities.
The protesters on the street have shown they're no longer willing to put up with it. What I want to know is, what is our government going to do about these injustices?
To stand any chance of improving the health outcomes of Black and minority communities, I believe we need the powers that be to acknowledge that systemic racism is a problem that needs addressing. When Equalities Minister Kemi Badenoch reported on the disparity of COVID outcomes in Britain, she acknowledged many of the issues I've explored.
The current evidence shows that it is a range of socio-economic and geographical factors, such as occupational exposure, population density, household composition, and pre-existing health conditions, which contribute to the higher infection and mortality rates for ethnic minority groups.
Yet, in response to a question in the House, she actually dismissed the idea that racism had played a role.
Many people talked about their experiences of systemic racism, but the findings we've come out with do not support that.
I can't believe she could have come to this conclusion, and I've asked her to talk to me about her report.
When I first heard that COVID was disproportionately affecting people of colour, obviously that piqued my attention. But I noticed that in the 62-page quarterly report that you delivered, that there wasn't a single mention of the word racism or discrimination.
What we found was the cause of it was very much to do with underlying health conditions, socioeconomic factors, and occupational risk factors were huge. It's not the skin color that causes the problem, it's the underlying risks.
It seems like we're ignoring the systemic reasons why people of colour are being kept at the lower end of the socio-economic ladder.
So in my place of work, for example, you can definitely see that there are people of colour, as you say, doing the security work, doing the cleaning work. But when we look at the rates of employment, for instance, we're on a par with other races. You can see visibly, even in positions of power, who's editing Vogue, who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Just little things like that. You can see that there is improvement.
Are you therefore saying that there's no barriers to black and ethnic minorities kind of improving their lot in the UK? It's a kind of level playing field.
The story we have in the country is actually one of progress. But what are the bulk of people who are especially coming to the country more recently doing? I think that's a different story. You shouldn't just come here and then be stuck in a particular social strata. But what are the tools to help people move on and up? Education is an obvious tool.
But education itself does have problems within it, which prevent black children from advancing to the better colleges, better universities. Mm-hmm. So one would have to admit that there is an element of structural racism within the educational system. I just don't understand why we're not admitting that there is structural racism. Well,
David, why don't you tell me, what are you defining as structural racism?
Well, I think structural racism is when the system itself prevents a particular group of people from advancing up the social ladder.
So I agree with you that those things have existed, but they are so much better. They are so much better than when you and I were at school, David. But in terms of the coronavirus pandemic, people felt it was racism. That wasn't what the evidence showed. But the fact that people feel that is itself a problem, which we need to tackle as well. And we're not avoiding the difficult subjects, but everything has to be based on evidence. And that's the approach this government takes.
I find this response so frustrating. If we can't get those in power to acknowledge the damage systemic racism is doing to the health of millions of people, then I believe we face an uphill struggle to effect positive change.
Consciously or unconsciously, our society still operates in ways that disadvantage black people, a truth that COVID-19 has ruthlessly exposed. But if any good can come out of this virus, it's that it's shone a light on health inequalities that cannot be ignored.